Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the kind of slaves' perspective of slavery. We talked a little bit about the institutional kind of view and the master's view and how they justified it. Now we're going to talk about a little bit about how slaves would have viewed it. Now, this is kind of a tricky topic because we do have some slave narratives that they took in the 1920s, but most of those people, while they were slaves at one point in their life, most of those were children by the time their stories were taken. They had grown up and they were 70, 80, 90 years old. So we have general ideas, but specifics we don't have a whole lot of. We have a few good examples, but for the most part, we're having to kind of extrapolate some of this information. So there's two main factors that determine what life was like for a slave at any given point in the United States, or really anywhere in kind of the Americas. So time and place. So what time period were you a slave and where you were a slave. So what part of the country, what particular plantation, all that kinds of stuff. So we're going to do some generalities here. So in the slave generations, the first we could talk about is kind of the charter generation. So first round of slaves. So we talked about this with Jamestown a little bit. The first round of slaves were indentured servants that very quickly over the course of just a few decades, 2 or 3 decades, went from indentured servants who could gain their freedom to racial slaves, where you inherited slavery from your mother. Now, that was bad enough, going from possible freedom to forever slave. But on top of that, they're building the first plantations. So they're having to basically go to places like Virginia or South Carolina or North Carolina, chop down forests, dig up swamps, and build a plantation from scratch. So they're having to do all the agricultural work, but they're also having to cut down trees, haul out roots, build houses, do all the labor in the houses, all this kinds of stuff, while also doing all the agricultural work, plus producing minor crops for themselves. So this is not an easy prospect for these slaves. Then you have the plantation generation. So this is where we're starting to get into the really big plantations, but they are a little more established. So you're having to do hard labor, but it's mainly the labor because the plantations are established. You know, if a new plantation is getting established, it's going to be kind of that charter generation style of work. But most of the time, this is where you've kind of reached a general equilibrium. It's not really easier work, it's just steadier kind of expectation. You know what's coming at you. Then you get the interesting period of the revolutionary generation. Now, this is a time period during the American Revolution where slaves, this was kind of their best option for freedom because you have the ideals of the American Revolution. All men are created equal, all this kinds of stuff. And many of the founding fathers genuinely believed it. And many of the states passed laws called manumission laws, which allowed uh, people to set their slaves free. So, like George Washington in his will, well, he waits till after he dies, but in his will, he sets his slaves free. So, not perfect, but if you were going to gain your freedom, it was probably going to be during the revolutionary generation. The final generation is the migration generation. So this is after slavery gets its kind of revival. Because during the revolution, slavery was seen as kind of a dying institution. They thought within the next 20, 30 years, slavery would die out. But with the invention of the cotton gin and the ability to grow cotton further inland, slavery booms. So slavery is moving west, with it cotton, and this is creating basically that charter plantation cycle again, except this time in the migration generation, you're adding on a whole new level of super racism, where you get a much more brutal version of racism, you get a more violent version, and this is where things start getting really bad. So it wasn't great to be a slave during any of these generations, but the migration by far is the worst. This is the kind you see right before the American Civil War. Now, there's two main types of slave experiences at this time. So you have urban slaves living in towns and cities, and rural slaves living out on farms and plantations. So you could argue that being an urban slave might be a little bit better. You're definitely not doing the same kind of hard labor. Odds are you're some sort of house servant, a butler, a maid, a cook, providing childcare, something along these lines. And you're typically dressed better because they're trying to show you off. You might have a little more free time because when they send you to run errands, you might be able to get 5, 10, 20 minutes to talk to someone, to get a break from the overseer's eye, from the watching eye of your master. So there are some benefits. You might even have a skill like a blacksmith or some sort of trade skill like musician that might actually earn you a little money. Now the master gets majority of the money. The master gets majority of the money, but a benevolent master might give you a small portion, a penny or a nickel for every dollar you earn. So it really depended on who your master was. Now, while there were some benefits to it, there were some problems too. Now, in cities and towns, you really couldn't beat your slaves the same way you could on a plantation. Because plantation, you're outside, you're isolated, no one to hear the screams, no one to judge you. In a town, if you start beating your slave, everyone's going to kind of stop and watch you and be like, oh, you're that kind of master. Like, you're a bad master. You don't really know what you're doing. So, this is kind of where the weirdness comes into effect. They couldn't physically harm them in the same way they could out on the plantation, so it often resorted to psychological manipulation, threatening of one's family, or if you were a woman, it might be sexual assault, sexual violence, or threats thereof. So there's benefits in some ways, but there's also drawbacks in others. So now, this was only a small portion of the population. About 10% were urban slaves. About 90% of the slaves were rural slaves. So they're stuck in the field doing field work. They work from sunup to sundown. So children, early on, as little kids, basically didn't have anything to do. They ran around, played with the white plantation kids, and then at a certain age, they were expected to begin doing chores. And then once they hit adulthood, they were expected to work in the field and reap the same amount of harvest that all the other slaves did. Now, adulthood was somewhere around 12 to 14 years old. Now, when you think about it, can a 12-year-old pick the same amount of cotton or tobacco as a 20-year-old or 25-year-old? Probably not. So you're going to see slaves having to work together to meet some of these needs. Now, what is provided for the slaves by the master? So clothing-wise, they're using or wearing typically something along the lines of burlap cloth. So like a potato sack, kind of a tighter weave version of a potato sack or grain sack. So not comfortable, it's going to be itchy, it's going to chafe. It's not a luxurious fabric at all, but it's the cheapest, most readily available thing, and it met the bare minimum of providing clothes to your slaves. Now, some slaves did get hand-me-downs from the plantation house. So if something was worn out, they could patch it and give it to a slave, and that did happen a lot. So when you see slaves in somewhat nicer clothes, that's usually why. Now, some masters also just might want to equip their slaves with nicer clothes. It's really up to the master. But clothing-wise, almost always going to be kind of in the burlap category. Food-wise, the primary grain for slaves was going to be corn. So you have cornmeal, which you can turn into cornbread or polenta or any kind of variety of porridges and different other baked goods, fritters, and different things like that. So this is the heart of kind of the grains that slaves ate. The other big component is salted pork. So you can kind of see an uncooked, kind of looks, it's basically pork belly, kind of the fattier version of bacon. And the reason they served this to the slaves, why they provided this to the slaves: cornmeal, cheap, easy to produce, high in calories. Salted pork, pigs, cheap, easy to produce, high in calories. Slave labor on a plantation is typically energy kind of extensive. So a lot of energy is being used on the plantation to do picking cotton, rural manual labor, all this kind of stuff. So you need high calories and you need it for cheap. Now, This is not the most healthy of diets. So slaves often supplemented with anything they could get. So often plantations had their own gardens to serve the big plantation house. So the slaves might get some of those vegetables. But usually plantations often set aside small plots of land for the slaves to have their own gardens. Now they had to do all the work themselves on their off time, but this was the best of both worlds. The slaves produced their own goods, produced their own vegetables and stuff, made the slaves happier, healthier, at no real cost to the plantation owner other than setting aside some small plots of land. So food-wise, what's provided is the bare minimum, and it's up to the slave to kind of enforce and reinforce their own diet. Now, the biggest problem of plantation slaves is going to be the violence experience. So this is where, like we saw in the beginning of the institution, slavery as an institution lecture, with the slave with the scars on his back. So this violence and beating takes a lot of different forms. It can be practically, what we kind of envision always as the harshness, which is the physical beatings, but it could be psychological, threatening to sell away someone's family, to rape someone's wife, to take away their kids, to any kind of number of things that could be done. So slaves are always kind of weighing these odds. I want to resist, I may not want to do what they're saying, but I could have this physical violence, or what's worse yet, my family might be hurt. So the punishments and the fear is pervasive for these slaves. So you wake up every morning not knowing what's going to happen or what might set off the master or the overseer or anything like that. So you can kind of see from this image kind of how plantation work would have been done. And there's kind of two main systems on how plantation work was done. So the simplest and most common was sun up, you go to work, sun down, you come in. And you try to get as much done as you can. And it's primarily picking cotton during the harvest season. That's kind of where the big bulk of the work is going to be. But there's a second system that proved more effective and also made the slaves happier because it gave them a little free time. It was called the task system. So instead of just making them work all day, where the slaves, they didn't have really any encouragement or impetus to work hard, they just kind of did a slow, steady grind. With the task system instead, they would say, you have to pick X many pounds or bushels of cotton. So once you hit, 80 pounds of cotton, you're done for the day. So the slave could work faster and faster, get done, and might have, an early afternoon off where he could go work in his garden or go do some side jobs for some money if the master allowed it. Now, the task system also had its drawbacks because you had to work hard enough to have a little bit of time left over at the end of the day, but not so hard that you were done, by 10 a.m. And the master's like, oh, well, if you can do it that quick, we better have larger quotas. So it's always this kind of negotiation of how far to push things and how far and how hard to work. Now, there's various types of passive resistance that a slave could do to resist the masters. So they could work slow. So if they're needing something, they need more food, need better clothes, need better shelter, whatever it might be, they might uniformly work slow. If one slave is being obstinate, they can beat that slave or punish that slave. But if all the slaves are working at the same rate, it gets much more difficult, and it's kind of a form of protest where they're still technically working. Technically, they don't deserve being beaten, but they're not producing at the rate that the master might want. So this provides them with a subtle form of negotiation. And the master might give them something as a form of encouragement to make them want to work harder. Damaging crops or tools. Now, white Southerners often portrayed African Americans as dumb, stupid, lazy. So the slaves would often take that perception and that, racist view of them and use it to their advantage. So they might break a tool and then play ignorant, like, oh, I don't know what happened. It just kept breaking. Every time I use it, it breaks. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. And then it's costing the master money and time to replace the tools, repair them, all this kind of stuff. But it's a form of resistance. It's minor, it's more of an annoyance, a thorn in the side, but sometimes that little victory might be enough to get you through the day. You might steal. This is definitely risky, but it did happen, and sometimes it happened in pretty big ways. There was one example where slaves dug a tunnel into the master's wine cellar and drank all his wine. That could go very poorly for the slaves, but we do have these weird stories where stuff does happen. Then you have just general negotiations. Depending on who your master was, they might be willing to negotiate, might be willing to compromise with you on some issues, like saying, well, if we get a little more food, or if we get a new set of clothes, we can work a little harder, or we can work longer into the evening, or we might be able to do this, that, or the other. So there is some negotiation really depending on the master. Some masters wouldn't entertain anything a slave might say. Others might be willing to listen. So it really depends on who your master was. Now, the ultimate form of resistance is, of course, running away. Now, it's generally unanimous. Slaves don't want to be slaves. So these African Americans are people, they want to be free. So why do more not run away? Why don't we just see mass exodus of slaves? Well, it's the risk. If you get caught, you're going to get punished. But it's not just you getting punished. If you're married, if you have a family or friends, they might get punished as well. Plus, if you run away and have to leave your family behind, odds are you're never going to see them again. So sometimes the terrible life of being a slave was worth living if it meant being with your family. So you got to understand, running away is an option, but it's also one of the kind of riskiest options of all. Now, the biggest factor that allows African Americans to endure the institution of slavery is their own communities. Now, while families get sold apart from each other, you're not always guaranteed to stay with your spouse or your parents or grandparents or anything else. They do create their own communities. They create kind of their own culture that exists in parallel with white Southern culture, and they kind of bump up against each other and interact, but they kind of develop along two separate paths. And you still see these two traditions in the South today. You see it in food and culture and music and all these kinds of things where they're similar and they bump in, you see some overlaps, but they're also unique in very particular ways. Now, one of the biggest things that slave communities were able to do was provide a sense of family. Even if they weren't your real family, when a new slave arrived, usually they were adopted in, supported, loved in some capacity, at the very least as a friend, just to help each other endure. Because if you didn't work together, it was going to be that much harder. But on top of that, many slaves chose to take spouses. Now, technically, it was illegal for slaves to get married, but masters encouraged what they called slave marriages. One of the big traditions was like you and your spouse would jump over a broomstick, and that would be kind of your marriage. That's what would bind you two together. Masters liked this because a married couple would have sex, and that would produce kids, and those kids were slaves, and that would be more slaves. So the masters didn't want to discourage it because that produced more slaves. But on top of that, if a slave has a family, he and she have something to lose. That gives you leverage over them. So not only is it making more slaves, but it's giving you leverage over them. So this is a big deal. Now, slave houses. So you'll still see these if you go around some of the old plantations that still exist around the United States today. You see some of these slave quarters, and here's some examples of them. So these are pretty small, rudimentary things. If you're lucky, like these, they had wood floors. Some only had dirt floors. And these are pretty basic buildings. They're basically one room for the family, and that's about it. You usually had 2 rooms per building, 1 room for an individual slave or a group of slaves or a family, and that was about all you had. You had a chimney to cook and keep warm, but that was really it. There's no real luxury. You might have utensils and plates to eat off of, but it's usually wooden or just pewter stuff that was left over, the cheapest they could buy. So this is not a luxurious life by any means. So this gives you kind of a basic idea of what life was like for slaves. Not glorious, not great, but it varied wildly depending on what time period and who your master was. Now, it's not to say that slavery was ever good, it's just degrees of how bad it could be. Because it could go from being bad and you're not free, you're kind of trapped here and you're forced to do work, to a living hell where you're constantly tormented, assaulted, beat, raped, all this kinds of stuff. So it's on a scale of how bad did it get. But nonetheless, this gives you kind of a ballpark idea, and we'll stop there for today.